Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to the next episode in Conversations. This is a special one. This is Conversations about the Quran. And I'm extremely grateful to Professor Joseph Lumbard, who has decided to talk to me about his fantastic contribution that he and his team, under the guidance of Sayyid Hussein Nasr, put together, the Study Quran. We will talk a lot more about this in a minute. But first, let me also thank the Islamic Community Center in Lancaster, who are very supportive of this series. Professor Joseph Lumbard is an associate professor in Qatar. He teaches in the Quranic Studies Department of the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. He is a translator and a commentator and a general editor in the Study Quran. He is both Mutarjim and Mufassir al-Quran, and he will remain so for the rest of history. Even when his obituary is written, it will say that he was a commentator and a translator of the Quran, mashallah. He received a PhD and MPhil in Islamic Studies from Yale University, an MA in Religious Studies, and a BA from George Washington University. He also studied in the Muslim world, in Morocco, in Egypt, in Yemen, and Iran. And he has been teaching courses in the area of Islamic studies, Sufism, mysticism, and obviously Quranic studies. So without much ado, welcome to Conversations, Professor Joseph Lumbard.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Khan. It's an honor to be here.
I must say that this is perhaps one of the most important events in my intellectual life. This has made my life so easy, whether I'm doing research or whether I'm planning to give a khutbah or give a lecture. In fact, I'm teaching a small class on the Quran for my family members, my brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews. And tomorrow I'm talking about Surah Fatiha. So I went and read a commentary on Surah Fatiha. It was interesting. I had forgotten about the hadith about 4 things that scared shaitan, and you reference to it, and I will start with that. So, and the kids will hopefully get engaged. So to me, this is one of the most important working tools in my toolbox as a scholar and as a Muslim intellectual and as a practicing Muslim. So in that sense, I think this is one of the most important things that has happened. But I also think that it is a turning point in Islamic studies in the West and in America. We now have a commentary on the Quran, a translation and a commentary on the Quran, which can be placed on the same shelf as the classics. So it deserves to be in the same bookshelf as Tabari and Fakhruddin al-Razi and Ibn Kathir and Qushayri's Lataif, etc. So that is an important thing, and it kind of says that the Muslim community in the West, especially in America, the Islamic intellectual community and scholars are coming of age, that they are producing work that is of great quality. So congratulations. I want to say a little bit more about it. This is a commentary that relies on 41 classical commentaries. It has 15 essays in it. It's over 2,000 words, and it is clearly written with an eye to assist both academics as well as practitioners of the faith who are speaking on these issues frequently. It is unapologetic about anything. And what is also interesting is that it has been written very well, and I commend you and your partners about it. So without much ado, let me start off with my first question. And I want to start with that hadith. And if you are familiar with the hadith, and I'm sure a lot of you always hear about it all the time, where Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "Khairukum man ta'allama al-Quran wa 'allamahu." Those who study the Quran and teach it are indeed the best amongst you. And what is interesting is that the title of your book is in that hadith, the Study Quran, and I found that very interesting. Those who study Quran and teach it are truly blessed. So having said all that, let me ask you the first question. Is this a commentary or is this an interpretation of the Quran? I got a little confused whether it is a tafsir or sometimes people use the word ta'liq, to comment on.
It's difficult difficult to say. I mean, one of the things that I would say that it doesn't fit into the mold of tafsir in the classical tradition, because usually when you find a tafsir is coming from within a particular school of thought, and part of the goal in penning that tafsir is to kind of provide a kind of intellectual girding for the scaffolding of that particular school of thought. And the way that we have gone about it with the study Quran, that's not our intention. Our intention is to provide a broad scope of what have been some of the predominant interpretations of the Quran over time, in addition to showing how the Quran is interlinked with other parts of it, and what the actual kind of real, direct language of the Quran often implies, which sometimes you're surprised is actually not as readily available in tafsirs as one would want. Even Abu Hayyan al-Gharnati took his fellow mufassirs, commentators, to task for what he thought they were obscuring the clear meaning of the Quran with the accretions of creedal readings of it. So by not doing that, we're not in the classical mold. That's why some people have called it ta'liqat, that is like notes on the Quran. But really, at the same time, one has to look and see that the definition of tafsir has really never been settled upon. People are always saying that, take, like, for example, Atha'alabi. Atha'alabi's tafsir was a very influential tafsir for several centuries. At the time that it was written, it was well known, it was studied by the scholars. And then there came to be a time when people tossed it aside and people wrote very nasty things about his tafsir. And it wasn't studied for many, many years. One couldn't find a printed edition of it just 30 years ago. Whereas you find the tafsir of Ibn Kathir, when it first came out, it wasn't that widely read or that widely cited or used. And for many centuries it wasn't. But then with the interest of certain groups within contemporary Islam in Ibn Kathir's tafsir, it has now become the most widespread. So widespread that I sometimes have to say to my students, yes, but Ibn Kathir is not God. When they ask me about, how, well, but Ibn Kathir says this. I said, yeah, well, what does the Quran say? And we go into Sufi tafsir. There's Sufi tafsir that people say, that's not tafsir. Well, okay. And people will say, well, Shia tafsir, that's not tafsir. Or Shiites might say, Sunni tafsir is not tafsir. So what is tafsir? Well, it's a huge, sprawling collection of approaches to the Quran. It goes beyond a genre. And when you look at tafsir that way, you could say that that when people are looking back on history, they'll put the study Quran in that category. Who knows?
I have a few questions which are methodological in nature. And my first question is a question you're asked often, is about the sources. So when I saw the list of the 41 tafasirs that you have primarily relied upon, when I looked at the list, I said, of course, of course, of course, of course, of course. And then this particular argument, and I even heard Sayyid Hussain Nasser talk about it in one of the events, as to how there was a conscious attempt made to exclude modernist and reformist contemporary tafasirs, especially people like Maududi and Qutb and others. And one of the reasons that you gave was that many of these people simply rehash Ibn Kathir and Tabari usually. So I understand that there is very little new, but this idea that let's exclude modern commentators in order to present a classical understanding of the Quran, it occurred to me that if your study Quran was around when you were doing this project, you would have excluded it too, right?
I guess you would say we would have, yes. Yeah, but one of the real issue there is that for the first study Quran to come out, it has to be something that is providing those dimensions of the tradition that have had staying power. And oftentimes when one starts to interact with contemporary material, one starts to fall into a kind of myopic view conditioned by presentism, and where people are actually using some of these verses in ways that we might be more familiar with. So, for example, some of the political interpretations that you'll find with Said Qutb, for example, and those are things that, for one thing, we want to avoid falling into that trap ourselves. But another thing is we really don't know what the state of some of these tafsirs will be in 100 years, 150 years. And it might just be that the time that we live in makes us think more readily about those interpretations. Whereas we can safely say that the time that we live in is not what makes us turn to Shawqani. It's not what makes us turn to Al-Alusi. It's not what makes us turn to Al-Qushayri. And so those are tafsirs that have really stood the test of time, that have been influential in various phases of the Muslim community over the centuries. And those seemed to be the most reliable way to go about constructing such a text.
I recently looked at some South Asian commentaries of the Quran, and I had this very strange experience that I'm reading commentary on verse after verse, and I find that in each comment there is qualitative difference. The first 2 or 3 paragraphs seems to be of reasonably high quality, and the next 2 are extremely political and ideological and polemical rather than instructive or academic or educational. And then it took me some time, and then I realized that the paragraphs that I was liking were essentially either summaries of Tabari or summaries of Ibn Kathir. So even in the contemporary tafsirs that you see, the heart of the tafsirs relies on the classical scholars. So I understand that I mean, they are inescapable, so to speak. I have 2 more methodological questions to you. So for example, the Quran says that there are 2 kinds of verses in the Quran: those that are metaphorical and those there are perhaps clear or legalistic, mutashabihat, and those which are mahkum. So when you were going about writing the commentaries and translations, did you ever ask yourself, is this a metaphorical ayah and therefore we should approach it differently?
Well, that's an interesting issue, because there's not even really full agreement on what that particular verse, the one you're referring to, verse 7 of Surah Al-Imran, there's not even full agreement as to what is meant there by mutashabihat. And so on the one hand, I mean, one wants to be cautious of that. But on the other hand, was because we were doing a study text, we had to deal with all of the particular verses that were there. And some people say it only refers to those verses that have the letters at the beginning of 27 surahs, like Alif Lam Mim, Alif Lam Ra, etc. And then others say it's particular things. And some people say, well, it's muhkam if you understand it. And it's mutashabih if you are one of the people for whom the meaning is a little bit more difficult to grasp.
That's an interesting way to look at it. There is also this idea of abrogation, which you all touch upon it in various, when you point out that, for example, when you were talking about 262, you point to the fact that according to reports from Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, 385 is supposedly abrogated that verse. So there is no divine list of which verses are abrogated and which are not. And even the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not tell us, well, here's this list. Some are pretty obvious that you can just look at the 2 verses and realize that, yes, these are abrogating verses. However, there is a political side to the way the theory of abrogation is used. So did you guys, when you were doing your commentaries, did you have a position on abrogation, so that when you encountered claims that this verse is abrogated or that, you decided to engage with it rather than just report?
Oh, I mean, in that we kind of followed the way that many other commentators have. For example, Al-Qurtubi, will often mention that some people say that this is abrogated, but other opinions say that it's not. We even have at the time of Tabari that he says that, for example, you gave the example of 262. It's a Tabari or a Tabarsi, I can't remember which one specifically, says that this cannot actually be abrogated because it's a promise from Allah
Yes, it was
subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Tabari who said
And
that, yeah.
what's that?
It was Tabari who
It was
actually
Tabari,
ends his
and God,
commentary by saying this is a promise of God and it cannot be abrogated.
God's promise, and it's also a khabar, a report from God cannot be abrogated. So these things, there's which verses are abrogated and which are not, is not something that there's full agreement on. You have some lists where you would have 17 verses that have been abrogated. You have others where you would have over 200.
Yeah.
And there was a period of time in which the vast majority of ulama agreed that the sword verse 9:5, verse 5 of Surah At-Tawbah, abrogated many of the verses. But then there's another question: is what is even meant? And Al-Qurtubi also brings this up in his tafsir. He says, people understand abrogation, naskh, differently today than they used to. He says that it's more like it limits the meaning of a verse, not that it completely eliminates the particular interpretation of that verse. And you find nuggets like this throughout the tafsir when they kind of acknowledge that some of these issues are not so hard and fast, a little bit more problematic than they're sometimes made out to be. And I would say that naskh, abrogation, is a very difficult topic that a lot of people need to be very careful when they talk about it, because when they say such and such abrogates such and such, what they mean is that such and such a scholar is of the opinion that such and such abrogates such and such. And even if they find, they can say that such and such abrogates, they say the majority of scholars are of the position that this abrogates. That's what you're saying when you're saying that one verse abrogates another. And that's a very important distinction that a lot of people don't make when they start to get into this particular discussion.
Yeah, it makes me very nervous when khabars about the opinions of the companions are sometimes reported as hadith, for example. According to hadith, even though they may be part of hadith collection, we cannot pretend that this is something that the Prophet, peace be upon him, has at least said. One other question about this is sometimes you do refer to scholars beyond the commentaries, like Faisal al-Tafriq by al-Ghazali, I've noticed you cited a couple of times. So on some critical issues, and that would be a judgment from your perspective, what are critical or controversial issues, did you feel the need to go outside the tafsirs and look at scholars who are specifically focused on just that aspect of the Quran or that particular ayah in order to include them in your commentary, or did you consciously try to limit your commentary to be sourced only by commentaries?
Well, we wanted it to be mostly sourced by commentaries, but sometimes the commentaries don't provide you everything. I mean, you could take, just for example, if you're going to be following the classical commentaries, sometimes they also were taking materials from other materials outside of the tafsir tradition and using them in how they interpret it. Sometimes you find it and it's not cited. And so we were very conscious. I mean, I'd say that there are several places, for example, where I draw from the Futuhat al-Makkiyah of Ibn al-Arabi.
Yeah.
And yes, there are places where I draw from the Ihya as well. Part of that also has to do with having background in some of those texts. And the fact that at times there are certain places where the tafsir tradition, I mean, I remember there are certain verses where you're looking through, and I have now consulted 30 different tafsirs, and I don't think anybody's getting this verse. So what do you do at that point? Because there is a point where one after another, what is said, when you read through commentators, I mean, there are days when commentators were basically like other human beings, and they went through particular passages and they just kind of passed them over. People have written before, and they don't add anything new. And then all of a sudden you find nuggets, gems where they really deeply engage a particular set of verses. And sometimes it's the same set of verses where there's a particular set interpretation that you find given in one way or another in almost all of the classical tafsir. And sometimes it just doesn't work. You're like, why weren't people engaging this on a deeper level? And so you do look at times, you are kind of forced to see if you can find other ways in which these verses have been engaged outside of the tafsir tradition.
You know, when I started looking at the facets of the Quran, obviously I turned to the tafsirs to understand things that I was not understanding. And one of the things that struck me is the confidence with which some of these scholars in the past have approached the Quran and saying, oh, well, now that I have understood it, let me explain it to you. And even though they do provide that, oh, there are alternative explanations and others have also looked at it this way, ultimately it is their own interpretation which follows through. And the best of the tafsirs are one where you can actually get the voice of the commentator itself. That's why Ibn Kathir is so popular, because he has a very clear, distinct voice that appeals to certain segments of the Muslim community. But did you also, I mean, did you have to grapple with your humility in order to be able to speak about the speech of God and say, okay, I understood this, now let me explain this to you?
I mean, one always has to, grapple with that. But to be quite frank, I never thought that I was, I would basically say after having done this, I've never thought that I have somehow grasped the word of God. If anything, in going through all of these different tafsir, I've become, ever more awed at the polyvalent nature of the Quran and how these seemingly simple words open up to so many different levels of meaning, refracted in different intellects and different hearts in these different ways.
If we were to do a word cloud, you know what a word cloud is, right? So,
Yeah.
So if this was digitized and then we would just run the word, if you did a word cloud of all the commentators you referred to, which would be the biggest name out there?
For each person who worked on the study Quran, each section, that would probably be different.
Oh,
So, for
interesting.
example, I would say if you were to go through Janer Dale's sections, that it would definitely be Fakhruddin Razi. If you were to go through Maria Daycakes, I'm not sure actually. I wouldn't be able to say, but probably if you were to take the whole of the study Quran, it'd probably be a Tabari.
Yes, I thought so. But I mean, that would probably be the case with nearly every major commentary in the world, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's set a baseline. It in terms of how we conceptualize tafsir today, Tabari is the one who established that, and it reigns through to this day.
In one of the issues with the commentary, especially if you look at the importance of Asbab al-Nuzul, and which is the occasions when these verses were revealed. If you look at Wahidi, we have less than 1,000 on record, and the rest of the Asbab are often derived from Tabari and others, early commentators. But the ahadith which are reported in by Mufassirs in tafsir literature, they have the same degree of authenticity as those ahadith which are reported in Sitta Sahih, because I don't think those traditions may have the same degree of authenticity, yet we are employing them in understanding God's words and the Quran, and because of the way we interpret those verses of the Quran, they will also have juridical implications by people who are then using tafsirs in order to give fatwas, etc. And while they may think that they are relying on authentic ahadith to give their fatwas, the interpretation that they're taking from the Quran, they could be relying on ahadith which may not have the same degree of vetting I'm not saying they are authentic or not. I'm saying the degree of vetting may not be just that as robust as they are for the Sitta Sahih.
Well, first, there's a few aspects of that question. When you start getting into fatwas, usually when people are going to be giving a fatwa and they're going to be citing a hadith, they're going to be very much aware of the degree of authenticity of the hadith, and in helping them, come to a judgment. And sometimes, if they are citing one which is not considered fully sahih, it will be because they know that there isn't one that is better authenticated, that they could be citing in that particular instance. But the broader question here that gets to the asbab an-nuzul is that, yeah, the asbab an-nuzul is a problem, and the way that it's been used is a problem. Even Ibn Ashur, in the introduction to his tafsir, he addresses this issue, saying that many people have misunderstood how to use the asbab an-nuzul. Even when you have sahih asbab an-nuzul, sometimes there are at least 5 different ways in which you use those. Sometimes they're absolutely necessary for unpacking the meaning of a verse. Without the asbab, we would not know what a particular verse meant. That's very rare. But there are a few instances like that. For example, the instances of Surat al-Mujadala. When a woman comes and complains to the Prophet of how she's being treated because her husband committed zihar, we would have no idea what this meant if we didn't actually have the asbab an-nuzul to explain it to us. But then you have other instances when a particular person was in a particular situation and a verse was revealed regarding that person's situation, and it doesn't change the meaning of the verse, but it illuminates the context of the verse. This is why I actually think that this asbab an-nuzul, it's better to translate it as contexts of revelation, because that's more what is meant.
Rather than causes, you mean?
Was that, yeah, rather than causes, because causes is also theologically problematical,
yeah,
because it implies that a contingent historical event forced the hand of God to bring down a particular revelation. Whereas what the way that we understand this is that these are contexts in which these particular verses were revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even when you go to Al-Wahidi's asbab an-nuzul, many of those hadith are not sahih. And you'll even find in Al-Wahidi, you'll find some asbab that, for example, with Surat al-Adiyat, that don't really match with one another. So you're not sure which ones to take. I mean, this is actually something I've been thinking of doing a YouTube video or something on this, because there's a lot of confusion that people have when they hear asbab. That if, for example, this verse was revealed regarding Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu. All right, so now that means it refers. No, it doesn't just refer to him. It refers to people who do the thing that he did in that particular situation, and he is now here an example of that. That's there's not just the question of which ones are sahih. There's also the question of how you work with the asbab an-nuzul effectively, and different people work with it in different ways. And even Ibn Ashur, 20th century commentator, he felt that there was a need for a lot of clarifications with this.
Like every verse has this quality of being a categorical imperative, right? Like it has a principle in it which is universal and probably timeless. So one of the things that asbab would do is to delimit it by contextualizing it and saying that, okay, this happened because of these circumstances, and therefore perhaps it is applicable only in this case or in these kinds of circumstances. So the second case would be instructive. The first case, I think, would not be very helpful, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there are instances when you do need the asbab to understand, what would be the type of situation in which one would act upon a particular commandment given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that is actually the minority of the cases of asbab an-nuzul.
I remember I give your the study Quran to a lot of students and to imams and friends also. So I remember giving it to a grad student, and I told her, treat it. This is one of the best examples of literature review that I can share with you. So in that sense, uh, when as believers, as Muslims, we approach the study Quran, we think of it as another tafsir among tafsirs, right? However, it is slightly different in the sense that you have said this elsewhere, that you have included opinions in it which you find repugnant yourself, perhaps, and yet you have included it because it exists in the tradition, and commentators in the past have included it, and you would like to point out to readers that, look, Muslims have understood this in many different ways. So in that sense, it is a more of a literature review rather than a personal voice or judgment. However, in the case of 548, I found that there was an argumentative tone which was very distinct from the other commentaries I read there, and I found that you were determined, and I think it was you who commented on that.
No, I didn't. I
Oh,
didn't
it was
write
not
that
you. Oh, so that's interesting, because when I was reading it, I said, "Oh, I think this is Joseph." But anyway,
No,
there was an.
Maria Daycake wrote the commentary on Surat al-Ma'idah.
Oh, so I found that it was very interesting to see that she was argumentative about it. It was very clear that she wanted the pluralistic meaning of that verse to stand out. Especially with the Sharatan wa Minhajan, that God has given different laws and different ways to different communities, which may be valid even today. So to me, that was very interesting. In fact, it also inspired some of your critiques to accuse you of having a pluralistic bias across the entire commentary. And by pluralistic, they did not mean that you included many voices, because they were upset that you included many voices, but the religious pluralism side of it.
Well, I mean, this issue of pluralism, I mean, I'm not quite sure, exactly what you fully mean by that. Because in terms of there being multiple religions that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed over time, this is very clear. I mean, this is part of the Quranic message, that there is a single kind of overall message. But I mean, this is one of the things where I actually found that some of these reviews, they actually took particular passages of the study Quran completely out of context.
Yeah.
So for example, when I think it was in a commentary on 4171 and 572, that one reviewer said that Maria Daycake was trying to provide a woeful justification of Orthodox and Catholic Trinitarianism. But actually, what happened is that is I hope you don't mind. I'll read what actually Maria Daycake wrote there. Is that she wrote that some could read it this way, but then she says, whereas the previous verse criticizes belief in the divinity of Jesus, this verse criticizes the form of the doctrine in which God is one of three separate entities to be worshipped. Some commentators understood the Christian Trinity criticized here to compromise God, Jesus, and the Mother Mary as three distinct deities. And she goes on and makes it clear that that the only thing that she's saying is that the Trinity, as technically defined within Trinitarian theology, is not specifically addressed within the Quran. And this is something that Fakhruddin Razi himself said, whereas people didn't even take the time to read what she had said carefully and accused her of saying, and it's like if I were to say, well, some people claim that you don't need to, I don't know, fast the month of Ramadan if you're a believing Muslim. However, it is clear according to all schools of law that you must fast Ramadan. And all you did was you took my quote that
Mhm.
said, some people say you don't need to fast the month of Ramadan. And you said, this is what Joseph Lombard said. That's the type of criticism that we came up against when people were criticizing the study Quran. There were people to whom we actually tried to say, oh, you took this out of context when they were saying stuff on social media. And instead of engaging us and going back
Yeah.
to the passage, they just blocked us on social media. So these types of criticisms, a lot of them weren't actually engaging the text in full.
You know, when I decided to talk to you about this book, and I've been using it for more than 3 years now, and I use it frequently. There were times when I was giving khutbahs every Jummah all over the state, and this would be my starting point for research. And so for this interview, I had to spend more than 10, 15 hours, not only reading up the critiques, the reviews, etc. And it was very clear to me that except a couple of very good, like Mubin Vaid's critique was, at least it was very apparent that he read a lot of it before he started,
Yes, Mubin Vaid's critique was done I've constantly said to people, this is the way you do it.
Yeah.
It was done with adab, it was done with ilm. I
Yeah.
don't agree with him,
Yeah,
but
neither
I'd
do I.
still say he did a good job.
Yeah, he did it. It was, and his own biases also came out very clearly in his review. And then Haddad also didn't do a bad job, but he did take cheap shots. And I
Excuse
will
me, Haddad did a horrible job.
well, I will come to him.
That I just went to,
Yeah,
where he took something out of context. That was him.
yeah, I know
That's
that was
one.
it.
That's one of several instances where
Well,
something was
what I
taken
meant to say
completely out
that
of context.
some reviewers, it appeared to me, looked at it for maybe an hour or two and then commented on it. And then there were others who spent a lot of time on it. And I think Haddad did spend a lot of time on it, but he was hunting for targets to shoot. So for example, when he accused you of misinterpreting, or accused the group of misinterpreting the story of Sodom, as the problem might be only forcible sodomy and not consensual homosexual actions. He does take a quote from one of the comments, and I was wondering what your take was on that point, because it appeared to me that he wanted to use that critique to completely delegitimize the entire project.
Yeah, so he actually, that's another instance where what he did was he took a particular passage out of context. And I mean, I can read the entire part that he took a part out of context. And what he says is that sourcelessness is another way of purveying outlandish ideas, such as the unreferenced speculation by some that the real crime of the people of Lot was forcible sodomy rather than consensual homosexual. This is an LGBTQ perspective. Actually, he leaves off Q, but anyway, he says it's an LGBT perspective that has nothing to do with scholarship of any kind, let alone exegesis. All right. What actually happened there?
It's on
I'll read
page
the passage.
436.
Yeah, I'll read the passage, exactly. I'll read the passage from the study Quran. Forgive me here for reading a long time in this discussion, but here's the whole passage, all right? The indecency for which Lot chastises his people is that of men coming with desire unto men instead of women, understood by the traditional commentators to revert to the practice of homosexuality, and sodomy specifically, a practice that the verse indicates originated with the sodomites of Lot's time. One report indicates that the people of Sodom engaged in this practice only with those who were outsiders in their town, which is consistent with their having demanded access to the angels who had visited Lot, whom they clearly perceived as foreigners. Other commentators, however, suggest that the men of Sodom preferred sexual relations with men to relations with women on a regular basis. The aggressive behavior of the men of Sodom in the biblical account, as well as in 1177-79 and 1567-71, has led some to speculate that the real crime of the people of Lot was forcible sodomy rather than consensual homosexual relations. Although the emphasis in verse 81, as well as in parallel accounts, and they're listed there in the commentary, is explicitly on the act of men desiring men instead of women. The insolent and violent manner in which the men of Sodom sought to fulfill their desires is clearly implied in the account of Lot found in 1177-80. So what it's basically saying is that interpretation doesn't really mesh with how this is presented within the Quranic text. And if you go to other passages within the study Quran where that particular issue comes up, that references, it mentions this and it references back to this particular commentary, saying go to this part of the commentary to see how that issue is dealt with. I don't know how anybody could read that as us trying to say that that particular interpretation, that it's only forcible, is actually in accord with what the Quranic text says.
One of the things I noticed from hostile Muslim criticism of the study Quran and also friendly Muslim criticism. So for example, Hassan Shibli of Canada, I was watching his video. They try to push it into academia. They're saying this is good for academics, but it is not good for Muslims. Muslims should be careful about it. Mubin Waid is very clear in which he says basically the tafsir does not contribute to your faith, and it is contrary to orthodox Sunni mainstream aqidah. Essentially, that's what he's trying to say. So, what is it about the study Quran that they are frightened of? I mean, they're fearing some kind of misguidance, na'uzubillah, from this book. Is it the content of the study Quran, or is it some of the things that people accuse Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr, that he could be Shia, he's a philosopher, he's a perennialist, and therefore not exactly a model Orthodox Muslim scholar, and therefore his work would not meet the stringent standards of Orthodox Sunni Aqidah?
Okay, well, that's hard to say. I mean, because you said they. So for each individual, I think it's something very different. Okay. And there are some people for whom it has been a very honest, my job as an alim is to support and maintain a particular aqidah for the community, because this is what will keep them within the bounds of Islam and will pave the way to the akhirah for them. And this just has too many different ideas in it. And so it's not going to be beneficial for them in that regard. So, yeah, alhamdulillah, I think that some people are sincere in that approach. Unfortunately, I think that there is another group of people for whom this was really about feeling that their particular little area was being threatened. And a lot of people don't want anybody to regard other people as being scholars in this particular area, as being those to whom others could look for guidance in this particular way. So I don't know. I mean, with each one of them, it's different, and different people have taken different approaches. And some people with whom I have great differences of opinion and different approaches have had great adab in how they've expressed these differences of opinion with me regarding the study Quran text. If you actually were to pick up the first printed edition and compare it to the last printed edition, you'll find that a lot of changes were made. That there were certain things that were places where consistency wasn't properly followed in the translation. There were places where something was slightly off in the commentary that has been corrected. And a lot of that has to do with interactions with other scholars. And, and I've sat down at tables with scholars and had debates where basically we came out and we agreed that, well, we just don't agree on these particular matters, but we respect one another's training and background. And alhamdulillah, let's hope that what they do is of benefit for the community and that what we do is of benefit for the community.
Is it safe to describe it as a Sufi-leaning commentary?
Well, I mean, I don't know what one means by Sufi, because there are some more extreme forms of Sufism, and I mean, I don't want to name any of them, but that might not be it. However, there are certain things in the Quran that are, you know,
Mystical.
that, well, I wouldn't say, I mean, we could say mystical, but that the focus of them is about tazkiyat al-qalb. And if you want to talk about ultimately what Sufism is the most widespread place in which you have established methodologies for the purification of the heart.
Yeah.
And it is the practice and implementation of those methodologies that is the focus of Sufism. And in that respect, that's right. It's Sufi. All right. If that's my understanding of Sufism, the most widespread science for the purification of the heart. Now, what will come through the purification of the heart is knowledge of the unseen. And so sometimes you have with Sufi tafsirs descriptions of things that one encounters in the unseen. That isn't necessarily something that everybody needs to hear in a tafsir. And so that's not something like, for example, the tafsir of Al-Kashani, which is known as the tafsir of Ibn Arabi, that's not cited a lot because there's not a lot you can actually do
With
with
it,
it.
yeah.
You know, there's a lot of things, for example, in the Haqa'iq tafsir of Abdul Rahman as-Sulami that you just really can't use because it's
Yes.
coming from, it's almost like the particular vision that a person who has dedicated him or herself to the purification of the soul has had through the encounter with a particular verse. So that's not something that you could actually put in there. But in terms of, you know, how are you going to understand the heart, and how are you going to understand, you know, certain verses that are speaking about processes of purification, you need to go to Sufi tafsirs for that.
You
And
know,
so, yeah, we have that.
speaking about the criticisms, I paid a lot of attention to the critiques and what they're trying to say. And I think that their fears are more about this imaginary negative direction in which young Muslims might go if they approach it uninitiated. But I think one of the reasons why a lot of Muslims whose linguistic skills are limited to English perhaps are uninitiated into the Quran is because there was no such commentary available to them. You know, I have like 20 different versions of Ibn Kathir, 10 volume, abridged, unabridged, 2 volumes, 1 volume, all free, by the way. And I lament the fact that I don't have an English translation of Fakhruddin al-Razi or even Tabari to some extent. And if I had them, I would be using passages from it in my classes. So I think what you have done is that you have opened windows into the classical tafsir literature. And even if people say that this is only limited to the classical age, fine, it's a great contribution. We now have access to the classical age. We also have, I think, opened the door to encourage other Muslim scholars to go ahead and do tafsirs. If someone is very strongly of the opinion that this is limited to classical and does not include modern, well, you're welcome to do a study Quran on modern tafsirs. You're open to study Quran on the perspectives of women on the Quran. And so I think people should take it positively and do that. To me, the greatest value is that it allows you to appreciate how Muslims have devoted their lifetimes and how much depth they have found in the Quran text. And you give us a glimpse of that. And to me, that is fantastic. So my question to you is, what next? You know, it's when Obama won the Nobel Prize so early on without doing anything, I kept wondering, what's he going to do? A young man, once he finishes his 8 years, what is he going to do? So what do you do now in your rest of your intellectual life after having done something like this?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, Said Hussein Nasser said that this was the most important project he had ever worked on in his academic life,
Yes.
which is, you know, a lot coming from a person who gave the Cadbury lectures and the Gifford lectures. I mean, he's one of only three intellectuals who's given both the Cadbury and the Gifford lectures, and been in the Library of Living Philosophers series. Those are all, you know, all together, that's a lot of accomplishments. But he said this was his most important project. You know, for me, one of the things that I'm actually doing now is I've moved to doing a podcast on the Quran, which is new, because I actually think that the podcast format lends itself quite well to doing an extended tafsir over time that will come out, and one that's very accessible. One of the problems that we often have as scholars is that we conceptualize our discourse with other scholars as our interlocutors, and we sometimes do not accept what a scholar has done that views non-scholars as the interlocutors as being scholarly and academic, whereas to really the skill of taking a lot of this information and distilling it in a manner that is still true to what other academics have written, but makes it accessible. That's actually, I think, sometimes far more difficult than writing an abstruse academic article that 12 people are going to read. So this is one of the things that I want to do with this series of Quran for All Seasons as a podcast. And another thing is, quite frankly, going in the more scholarly academic direction. We need to do an entire, like 20, 30 volume kind of, like the Anchor Bible commentary. We need to do something like that in the English language. I honestly don't know if we'll ever be able to do it because of some of the limitations of how academia is structured today, and more importantly, how inept the Muslim community is in realizing how they need to get behind such projects in order to make sure that it is Muslim voices that are heard when we are speaking about our traditions and our texts.
I read somewhere that Hajar Asqalani, the one who wrote Fath al-Bari, the commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari in 70 volumes, apparently when it was published or printed or finished, there were celebrations in the city for one whole month.
MashaAllah.
In the city of Baghdad, they celebrated it for 1 month.
MashaAllah.
There were parties for 1 month. And I was wondering whether you guys were given a party or not. So next time, inshallah, if I have an opportunity, I would love to host a party. I think the Muslim community needs to celebrate this. No book is perfect other than the book of Allah. And any effort that is done, this is monumental. This is 50 years of work, right? 5 of you working for 10 years. And I
didn't think of it that way, but yeah, you're kind of right. Yeah, MashaAllah.
Yeah, and I looked at it and I realized that if I were to start this, if I had started it, it would probably take me 200 years to be able to do something like this. So it is a monumental work, undoubtedly. And it is also, I hope it challenges other Muslim scholars to take up projects like this. And we really need that level of scholarship. Increasingly, English is becoming the language of Islam and Muslims worldwide, the language through which we engage. And having such quality work, I think, will only enrich Islamic studies. Fortunately, I think, hopefully, your location may be able to, for you to garner resources which will be able to provide that 30-volume tafsir that you are seeking. Inshallah, and I hope and I pray that you and your family are safe in this difficult period, and I'm extremely grateful for you to take time out and talk to me about this. There's one request, or I don't know, shall we say, that I heard Dr. Nasser saying that future editions may have the Arabic text of the Quran. It's like saying there is no Quran in the study Quran, in the absence of the Arabic text. So I know it will lead to 2 volumes. The font sizes are also very small. I just discovered that I'm also getting old. I now have glasses. So I think that a 2-volume edition with a slightly bigger font on the commentary part and the Arabic text is something that I think the American Muslim community should be able to sponsor. How expensive can it be if the community decides to subsidize it? And I think that I want to use this occasion to appeal to the American Muslim community to invest in projects like this. It is some postmodernists consider books as monuments of history. So when they try to do archaeology of history, they look at books as monuments. And I think that you and your team have indeed built a very beautiful monument of Islamic civilization in the West. Congratulations to all of you. And thank you very much for talking to me, Joseph Lumbard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, Professor Khan.